Welcome everyone to our first Elie Wiesel Center Book Talk of Spring 2021. I'm Abigail Gilman. I'm a professor of Hebrew, German, and Comparative Literature at Boston University. And I want to start out just with some thank yous. First of all, thank you to Jeremy Solomons, who is the communications coordinator of the Wiesel Center, for all his help with advertising and registering and working with us on this series. And he's going to be helping us this evening. And I also want to mention that while this our book talk series is also partly sponsored by the Leon and Alice Newton Family Lecture Fund. And I'm sure some of you have been to Newton lectures in the past. This has been a tremendous opportunity through this fund to have speakers in Jewish studies over the years. And I'm, Eitan, you're not aware of this, but we've had speakers, we've had Ruth Weiss and Ruth Calderon from Israel and Art Green and Hillary Putnam, and all kinds of wonderful people that this series has, this fund has made possible. And so today I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Eitan Fishbane. Dr. Fishbane is Associate Professor of Jewish Thought at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he teaches courses on Jewish mysticism and spirituality. He's been at the seminary since 2006. He's the recipient of many prestigious fellowships. And he, in addition to the book that he's going to be speaking about today, he's the author of another book, As Light Before Dawn, The Inner World of a Medieval Kabbalist, from Stanford Press of 2009, came out in 2009. So, I just want to say that I'm really excited to learn about your book. The book is titled The Art of Mystical Narrative, a Poetics of the Zohar, Oxford Press, 2018. And just on a personal note, I'll say that, as a student of Jewish literature and Bible translation, I primarily modern literature, I have to say that Kabbalah has always been a little bit outside my intellectual comfort zone. But I'm just tremendously excited by a project that, like yours, which seems to be kind of breaking down the boundaries between religious and imaginative literature. And that's a project that I deeply subscribe to. And a book that writes about the Zohar and about the ways that fiction and poetry and theater and drama and performative gestures are deployed. Moreover, a book that on Kabbalah that quotes my own doctoral dissertation advisor, Professor Dorit Cohen, in one of the first chapters, who's a narratologist. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Fishbane. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll have a, about, about 45 minute presentation. We'll have time for question and answers, and feel free to write any questions in the chat during the presentation, and I'll be moderating that discussion following. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Gilman, Abby. It's really an honor and a pleasure to participate in the BU broader community, and I'm honored by the gracious invitation. So it's really a great pleasure to do this and to share a little bit about this this book, which came out in hardcover in 2018, and paperback in 2019, and on all those good things, and really, in many ways, has been at the center of my my intellectual life and thinking. Uh, my career, really, the kind of the interest in the correlation, um, the correlation between mysticism and literature, mysticism and poetry, and in the case more specifically of this book, mysticism and poetry. Zohar's mystical poetry is going to be the much anticipated sequel,
Hmm.
which you might have to wait another 10 years for, but it was not quite that long. But in any case, that's also a great interest to me, and is dealt with in various ways, direct and indirect, also in this book. But really this book is focused more on the narratives of the Zohar, but more broadly, really raising the question, um, which Abby, you were getting at, um, which is a kind of methodological, interdisciplinary type of question, right? The degree to which, well, what first of all, what genre, or what discipline does the study of this particular form of Kabbalah belong to, right? The question of of how poetics, in a broader sense, applies to other forms of Jewish mystical literature, I think, is a very interesting question, and is certainly applicable in many cases. But the Zohar has long been famed for its role as a classic of Jewish thought and ideas, mythology, theology, metaphysics, and was uh, brought to greatest light, perhaps first by Gershom Scholem, and then by others, in terms of its role as a classic in the history of Jewish thought, or Machshavet Israel, as it's referred to in the Israeli context, and really how it functions as as one of the great examples, as kind of the pinnacle of Jewish mystical thought, of Kabbalistic thought, in late 13th century, early 14th century Iberia, or what we now call Spain. And how it represents really the summit of that century of or more of creativity, and then which went on to really be viewed as the great classic, um, of Jewish mystical literature, um, and of um, of Kabbalah in general, and the way in which it influenced, in a very powerful and significant and heavy way, um, the development of Kabbalah in subsequent Jewish mysticism. But really, the core, I would say, of what I seek to do in this book, and we're going to look at a number of different examples eventually, and also I'll give a bit of an overview of some of the major arguments of the book. Before we do that, is really an attempt to capture, or perhaps recapture, the ways in which Kabbalah, the ways in which the Zohar ought to be understood as one of the great works of Jewish religious literature, as literature, in the history of Jewish civilization, not just as one of the great works of Jewish thought, which it is, and the history of Jewish ideas, which it is, and of hermeneutics, which it is, but the degree to which we can begin to appreciate this text also through the lenses of literary critical studies and literary studies, both in its larger context in time and place, which I seek to do especially in chapter 6 of the book, Zohar, Frametail in Context, and elsewhere, and elsewhere in the book, but also on its own terms. In other words, one of the questions that I raise, which I think you saw in one of the excerpts, is why was the Zohar understood to be such a powerful? Why was it understood? Why did it come? How did it come to achieve this status of classic in the history of Jewish mysticism in particular, and Jewish civilization more generally, right? What is it that makes for a classic, right? Is one of those key questions um, that we can ask with respect to the Zohar, but also really what do we gain and what is illuminated for us by understanding this actually as one of the great works of imaginative literature, both in a poetic sense and in a narrative sense, in the history of Jewish civilization. Um, so let me just first say generally, um, uh, both just for those who don't know, where the Zohar fits into its historical context, and what are its kind of macro genres, even before we start to drill down a little bit into its literary forms as I try to develop them in the book. So first, as I mentioned before, the Zohar, it was a work of late 13th century, early 14th century Spanish Jewish mysticism. Those are the words. Using the word Spanish, and there is something of an anachronism, and was a remarkable example of what has been called pseudepigraphical literature. Right, this is I know some of these terminologies familiar to many people and unfamiliar to others. I'll do my best to fill in between the lines. Pseudepigraphical in the sense that it was presented from the beginning as the product, as the work of the second century Tannaitic sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and features, as we'll talk about, him as a protagonist and his disciples, and is attributed to that ancient author, attributed to this revered ancient author, and projected onto antiquity, we can say, as was characteristic of a number of different works across religious cultures in the Middle Ages, right, of an attempt to establish both legitimacy and heightened reverence for a work by projecting it onto antiquity, but nevertheless was the imaginative work of these turn of the 14th century, these late 13th century Iberian Jewish mystics or Spanish Jewish mystics, right? And in that respect, as I'll come back to in a moment, it's both an attempt to reinvent antiquity, right, or to reinvent midrash, to reinvent rabbinic literature, right, because it's presented as rabbinic literature, but it's essentially invented by these medieval authors in such a way as to try to seem like ancient or late antique rabbinic literature, um, but when in fact it was written in medieval Spain. So this is, and that's significant in a number of respects, and it was written in a highly inventive Aramaic, whereas most Kabbalistic works of the time in the Middle Ages were written in a very literary Hebrew. But this seems to have been part of its attempt to project itself back onto antiquity and also to cast a kind of spell of mystification, right? Which you might feel yourself falling into as the time progresses. Abby's already experiencing it. Okay, so the um, but what constitutes this work? So let's just kind of look at macro genre first. So first, it's projected back as it's presented as this ancient midrash of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even though it is actually a medieval work, and there's all kinds of scholarship to back that up. We're not going to get into that right now, but that in itself is enormously fascinating, at least to me, right, in terms of this, and is reflected in one of those pieces that were distributed to you, right, of this collapse of fiction and history, right? And you could say that that's the case for rabbinic literature itself, right? And scholars of rabbinic literature could certainly say, right, that rabbinic literature also engages in this act of fictionalization of history and so forth. This is perhaps even more extreme, right? Because it's essentially it's being written from this lived place, medieval Iberia or medieval Spain, and imagining the world of ancient Galilee and ancient land of Israel. Um, but what constitutes it? We know it's written in Aramaic. We know that it's projected pseudepigraphically back to the Tana of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who does not seem to have been a whether he was actually a mystic or not, was certainly not considered to be one of the paradigmatic mystics of old, right? That would have been somebody like Rabbi Akiva. So why was the choice to project it onto Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? And there have been different types of speculations on that question. But what constitutes the text of the Zohar? So the Zohar is essentially at a kind of larger in an aerial view, is this mixture, this interweaving of two larger genres. The one being this kind of epic tale, though it's a highly episodic, fragmentary epic tale. So it's not quite the Odyssey in that respect, but it has been characterized by scholars as epic in the sense that it features a hero, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's on a quest for deeper, in this case, spiritual, mystical wisdom, and wanders about in these tales that are presented, right? And they're presented as if they are historical reality, but they are essentially the fictional tales of these medieval Spanish mystics about an imagined ancient Galilee, right? And imagined in particular, and land of Israel more broadly. And that in itself is extremely fascinating. So a major kind of a stratum or thread of genre, if we can say this, is of the imagining of this hero-like figure, this larger-than-life figure, saintly, miracle-working, master, spiritual guide and teacher, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and his band of faithful disciples as they wander about outdoors, right? So it's set outdoors as they're wandering on the path of Galilee and somewhat broader than that, right? might sound like another ancient Galilee tale that you might be familiar with teacher and disciples, and that's not incidental, I think. Wandering about the ancient Galilee in quest of mystical wisdom and the various happenings that occur along the way, the different figures, characters, personalities that they meet on their peregrinations, on their sojourn through this ancient Galilee. We'll talk a little bit about that momentarily, but I would say that one of the major genres is this tale of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples wandering about this reimagined land of Israel, in quest of mystical wisdom. Just a dramatic pause to have a drink of tea. Okay. So, and the other major macro genre that we can talk about are the discourses, the mystical discourses that are spoken by these different disciples and their master teacher and the characters that they meet along the way, which essentially become extended mystical midrashim, right? It's essentially extended mystical discourses about the metaphysics of the cosmos, about the inner mysteries of God, about the nature of the universe and the cosmos, as filtered through a constructed midrashic form, right? Emulating older midrashic forms. In some cases, we might point to the debated Petichta form, right? Whether that is actually a form or not. But the question of midrashic form, right? So and so opened and said and quoted a verse from here and quoted a verse from there and gave a midrashic discourse. But in the Zohar, that becomes mystically topical and infused, right? So that the content of what's talked about ultimately through the hermeneutics of the text, right, through a very midrashic type of discourse. So in that sense, they're quite successful, you might say, at passing it off as so-called older midrash, presents all of these Kabbalistic mystical ideas about the inner mysteries of divinity, through this exegetical, this hermeneutical lens. So kind of taken from an aerial view or kind of macro genre, we have this story of the master mystic and his disciples on their walking journey, and the Torah that they speak, right? And they speak about this as speaking Razin Deoraita, the mysteries or the secrets of the Torah, on the way and on the Orcha, on the road. So it's actually quite interesting that this actually happens outdoors, and we're going to see actually in one of the texts that we'll look at that this becomes significant because of the way that they engage with the natural world as well, right? So in other words, the setting, this outdoor setting, as opposed to, let's say, in the interior of some building, right, or whatnot, in the study hall, right? Instead, it's Torah spoken along the way, is what becomes significant. So the Zohar really is this interweaving of these two genres. So let's now drill down a little bit, and I want to pick up first actually on part of what Abby you had mentioned also, which is really dealt with in the first chapter of the book, and attempts to study Zoharic literature as a kind of dramatic, theatrical, performative literature, and that's certainly in the tale of Rabbi Shimon and his disciples wandering about, and the content that they speak, the mystical content, are those homilies. So in this sense, we find a number of different features that I try to point that I develop in the book. One is the Zoharic use of dramatic monologue, or the soliloquy, right, which has been studied in very interesting ways by different scholars of literature. Is perhaps most famously found um, in the works of William Shakespeare, but is also all over the place, right? So in other words, the idea that the dramatic monologue being this kind of utterance, or theatrical exclamatory utterance of the character, um, that in many cases is not necessarily presented always in dialogic format. That is to say, it's not necessarily in a kind of conversational way, right? And here this also plays into the larger theoretical discussion that Bakhtin talked about, the relationship between monologue and dialogue, and at what point does the novel actually truly become dialogic. And you might say that the Zohar is in many ways a kind of series of monologues, as opposed to them actually really talking to each other. But I think that we could also point to some ways in which there's give and take. But the dramatic monologue, and why this is particularly significant, is that it becomes, especially in the Zohar, and this is not restricted to the Zohar, becomes a way of the narrator speaking about the interiority of emotion and feeling, and thought, without actually saying in an omniscient way, character X was thinking and feeling in such and such a way, right? So it becomes this kind of showing of emotion in that respect, but it's also a speaking out of the interiority of the mind, right? And this is also, I think, this is definitely an important feature of uh, various powerful literary texts, and I think that this is an interesting dimension of Zohar as literature, right? The dramatic monologue insofar, and soliloquy insofar as it um, conveys and articulates the interiority of the emotion of the character, without the intervention of the omniscient narrator inserting themselves into that flow, right? And in the cases, both in the pieces that you received, in one of the texts that we'll look at, this is often heavily focused upon the lament theme. That is to say, I would say in some ways, the dramatic monologue moves back and forth between the lament theme and the gratitude theme, and the which are both different and the same, depending on how you look at it, right? So it's lament in the sense that it becomes a kind of, often as is a response to a particularly revelatory teaching from often from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself, and specifically will be a kind of woe to the world when you depart from it, Rabbi Shimon, because the world will be then orphaned of your light, and who will teach the mysteries and illuminate the lights of Torah then? So it becomes this anticipatory elegy. It becomes this moment of an anticipatory lament, because it usually happens. Um, it's almost always happening while this character is still alive. It's a kind of lamenting of his future departure and what that will mean for the presence of mystical wisdom in the world. And that also, as Abby, as you alluded to, is related to theatricality, and this is also in chapter 1. Theatricality through the use of dramatic physical gestures. This was quite significant. I found in my research into this that the authors of the Zohar will often utilize the representation of physical gesture to underscore different types of emotional states, to underscore different types of relational dynamics between characters. That can include full prostration on the ground. The most common is that of the kiss of greeting, right? That the one character will greet another character and say how wonderful it is to see and kiss the face of the Shekhinah, which is so fantastic on so many levels, right? Because it's a blurring of gender lines. It's an expression of the eros among the characters. It's about love and friendship. It's about the Shekhinah is the feminine dimension within the Sefirot of God. So it's also the feminine dimension of God manifesting in the male face of the male friend, right? Because these were male fellowships, at least as they have been preserved. And it's also the actual gesture of the kiss, right? And sometimes it's said specifically that it was a kiss on the mouth too, right? So that too is actually really quite remarkable, both in its I think you could say it's homoerotic, homosocial dimensions, but also just in terms of the eros and passion of friendship and of mystical friendship, and what that ultimately means, and insofar as it lies really at the heart of the Zohar, is the dynamic of the friendship among these different disciples and their love for each other and their master teacher, right? Their saintly teacher. This I think actually leads us in a valuable way to another issue that I want to underscore. It happens to be reflected in chapter 2. I'm not just going through chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, but it just happens to be that way. But that has to do with this, right? If these characters are on this journey, this wandering journey, then they are often encountering different personalities along the way. And one of the recurring themes that we find in the Zohar is the encounter with characters who present as so-called simpletons or fools, right? Or the characteristic donkey driver, which was like the medieval equivalent of I don't know what, right? But it was not necessarily deemed to be that was going to be the deepest mystical scholar you were going to encounter, and this is in their hierarchy of values, right? So, but this recurs quite frequently, and also recurs that the characters seem to make the same mistake over and over again, right? They keep encountering these characters, and they assume this person has nothing to teach me. This person is a fool, is a simpleton, just spends their days leading around the donkeys. But what it turns out to be actually is that after a little bit of time of playing this game with them, right, and leading them on to think that in their mistaken perception, the donkey driver or other so-called simpleton turns out to be the greatest mystical sage that they had ever encountered, and they're totally blown away, and they prostrate themselves, and they say and this is this moment of gratitude, right? We're like, how blessed and lucky are we that God made a miracle for us, that we experience this moment and learn from this great mystical sage. And this theme that recurs, which Aristotle referred to as anagnoresis, and other scholars of comparative literature have studied in terms of the poetics of recognition. There's a very important book on this, nothing to do with Jewish literature, by Terence Cave, called Recognitions, and there's a number very, it's an important theme in the comparative study of literature, the idea of inverted expectations and the poetics of recognition, where one didn't of character, where one didn't necessarily assume that to be the case at first glance, right? This also has, part of the argument that I make there in the book, this has also ethical implications that the authors of the text are trying to convey, right? So don't assume that what is presented at first glance is all that there is, right? And that's a broader mystical kind of principle, you might say, right? Of don't assume that what you see at first glance, the superficial, is all that there is. There's a deeper mystery to the Torah, to the person, to the world, and so forth. But this becomes also ethicized in that way, because these so-called spiritual masters are continuously being very judgmental of these seeming simpletons who turn out to be, perhaps it would be better if they just were simpletons and they learned to appreciate them for being simpletons, but that's not really the point. They come to, they become the fools, right? The sages who make these judgments about the outer appearance of these characters, who turn out to be great sages in disguise. So that's another major literary trope. And I'll just say parenthetically, since I want to be mindful of the time. There's another whole chapter in the book that deals with narrative ethics in a broader sense, which really is less. It's generally less about mysticism in its classic sense, and more they become exemplum tales of instances where characters are acting in a particularly virtuous way. Narrative ethics, of course, scholars of literature and philosophy, is its own important genre that has been studied by a variety of important scholars, including Adam Zachary Newton and Wayne Booth and Martha Nussbaum and others, and this is very important, and Hauerwas and other philosophers and scholars of literature and theologians. The idea that narrative becomes a means by which a certain moral lesson is taught to this, in this case, the religious devotee, right? And let me just give one example of that. That's particularly related to the intersection of the so-called mystical theological and the ethical, and that's discussed in chapter 4 in mystical narrative ethics, which is not actually in one of the portions that you have there, but it's particularly about the holiday of Sukkot, and in that case, the story that's recounted is this character, Rab Hamnuna Saba, who seems to be an imagined figure in the panoply of characters of the Zohar. It says that he would, before entering the Sukkah, on the holiday of Sukkot, he would first stand at the doorway and say, "Tivu, tivu, ushpizini line, come sit down, you upper guests." Right. This tradition, by the way, of ushpizin, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the guests on Sukkot, right, inviting biblical characters into the Sukkah. Thank you, Abby. Ushpizin guests on Sukkot, yes, that is that's actually something that originates in the Zohar, as far as we know, at least in this terms of this usage. What he really means actually there, though, is is come down into the sukkah, you heavenly guests, right? You dimensions of God, come be present in the sukkah, and then I will come sit down. But then the text goes on to say, and in somewhat parallel form to what Moses Maimonides had to say about one who feasts, right, in their closed courtyard and keeps the poor person out, right. Then the citation is from the book of Micah, right, that then your feasts are turned basically into dung and so forth, right. It doesn't sound too good. The idea being, right, that that the Zohar goes on to say very explicitly that essentially the portion that was to be, and this is almost like feeding the gods, if you will, right? Even though for the Kabbalists they would never admit that, right? This is really about the idea of the many that are the one, but it's a very strong feature. The portions that were to be for those ushpizin ilayin, those upper guests that are part of God, that food, that portion is to be given to the poor in your community. That is to be given to, you should take people into your sukkah, right? This is part, and that was actually a tradition very much in the Middle Ages, where it was more common to actually invite um, uh, um, various poor people into, and hungry people into one's own sukkah, to one's table. So there it becomes, and it also goes on to say there very explicitly that if a person disregards this ethical imperative, then the ushpizin ilayin, the divine guests, will say, see you later, and they'll fly back up to the heavenly realm. In other words, the theological mystical presence is directly dependent and directly correlated to fulfillment of the moral virtue, and to fulfillment of the ethical prescription of compassion, of charity, of generosity, and so forth. Right. So that I think is quite significant. There are a whole range of other literary features which I don't necessarily think it makes sense to delve into. I think that it'll probably be good to look at a passage from what you have there, if you think this makes sense, Abby, and then we could open it up for some discussion. So here. I'm particularly thinking about the piece from the sheltering tree section, right? I think that's and right. I believe that's the 163 one, and then 166 of the book, I believe.
Let's see.
And I know that behind the scenes, Jeremy is pulling that up
Thank you,
for us.
Jeremy.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That's great. Okay, so this is relates really to this principle of that I was mentioning before, both of the outdoor setting of the Zohar, which I think is really itself a very interesting feature, right? The outdoor versus the indoor, interior, exterior, the study of Torah along the way. But then also more specifically as a literary motif, how encounters with the natural world, right? Whether we call this kind of the presence of naturalism also in spiritualist literature, right? Whether we're thinking of modernists like Emerson or Whitman or Muir and so forth. And it certainly cuts across time as well. But the degree to which, for the Zohar, the encounter with elements of the natural world in Alma Tata'a, Aramaic for the lower world, correlate to dimensions that exist above in the divine world, right? Encountering the lower earthly world becomes a kind of contemplative moment for thinking about, contemplating, even experiencing um, the divine realm above. So here, this is a very, very fascinating opening here, and I'll just read it in my English translation here, and for those of you who are comfortable with Zoharic Aramaic, it's provided for you there on the right, or if you want to just have a glance at it. Right, so Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Elazar, by the way, is the son of Rabbi Shimon and also one of his disciples. We know that already from rabbinic tradition. Rabbi Yossi were sitting one day under the trees in the plain facing the Sea of Ginosar, which is the Sea of Galilee, Yam Kinneret. So you can you can imagine this scene, right? They're kind of having a beach day, if you will. All right, so it's not quite that, but they're sitting under the trees, the beauty of the trees overlooking the Sea of Galilee, right? And then look at this interesting statement, which those of you who know your Mishnah, you'll see how this is making a very subtle but bold statement. Rabbi Shimon said, "How lovely is this shade that is spread over us from the trees. We must crown this place with words of Torah. Kama ya'et sila da dechafi alan." Now, the reason why I mentioned the Mishnah is that classically in the Mishnah it says that one who stops reciting the Mishnah in order to say how lovely is the shade of this tree, or how lovely is this tree, is as they say in Yiddish, afzaris, or is gonna have problems, or is in their words actually is liable for the death penalty. They don't quite mean it that way. It's their way of saying it's going to be it's a really bad thing if you interrupt your Mishnah study. In that case, even to behold the beauty of nature. And what that actually means in the rabbinic and Mishnaic context has been somewhat debated. But what we see here is Rabbi Shimon, who, by the way, is this he's actually a Tannaitic character, but in the Zohar's rendition is a pseudo-Tannaitic character who is inverting a Tannaitic statement, right? A Mishnaic era statement, which is very interesting, saying that we see how lovely is this shade of this tree. So what should we do? We should crown this place with words of Torah. Anan tzarichin le'atra hay atar b'mile deoraita. You got to hear the music of the Zohar to appreciate it. That's why I give a little Aramaic in there. Its musicality is actually, I think, a major dimension of the Zohar's mystical poetry, but for that will be for the sequel. And so what's very interesting is that the beauty, or the pleasant sensation of the experience of the natural world here becomes the stimulus for the imperative to speak words of Torah, which for the Kabbalists means words of mystical Torah, right? Mile do, right? So it means that okay, so we're sitting here overlooking the sea, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. There's this beautiful shade of the tree. Never mind that Mishnah, wink, wink, right? Because it's supposed to be contemporaneous. But that should be a stimulus for us to speak spiritual words and draw draw theological, mystical meaning, which I think is enormously significant and fascinating. And then let's turn, Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind calling up page 166 here, which is where after there's a bit of stuff, a bit of material that happens in between and so forth. But then we have Rabbi Shimon as part of his as part. Let me just go to the top of that text. Actually, that's perfect. Thank you. The Rabbi Shimon as part of his expounding on mystical Torah. This is an example, right? So we saw a little bit of an anecdote of a little bit of narrative. Sometimes it's longer than that. Sometimes it's just brief like that. Though that itself is this kind of poignant moment of them experiencing the pleasurable sensations of out of doors. He then opens with a mystical homily, which relates to trees and wood. We're going to see, and is, I think we'll see here, a kind of poetic rhetoric as well. Though we won't delve too far into that, given our time. Rabbi Shimon opened and said, quoting the Song of Songs, King Solomon made himself a pavilion from the trees of Lebanon, or a palanquin, right? A kind of portable throne. Right? Apirion asalo melech Shlomo me'atzei halevanon. Now, from the trees of Lebanon. So first, it's not insignificant in my reading that he's giving a homily that is utilizing a verse with the word trees in it, right? So he's what does the mystic do when the mystic sits under a tree? The mystic gives a mystical homily related to trees, right? Which is almost like the mystic's version of spontaneously composing a poem for the occasion, right? Which is spontaneously composing a mystical homiletical poem for the occasion. And for him, it's also very much a theological reflection. This verse we have established and has been discussed. So he's saying that we've talked about this verse elsewhere in the Zohar in our discussion. Sometimes that's an actual internal reference. Usually, it's just it's not. It might just it could either be or not be. But this pavilion, this palanquin, this apirion, is the lower palace, which is modeled on the upper palace. It is this apirion da heichala diletata, the iukegavna de heichala ila, which is modeled on the upper palace. So here, this is a reference to the lower palace is, if you know your sfirot, the inner 10 dimensions of God, the lower palace is Shekhinah here, and the upper palace, Heichala Ilah, is Bina, is the upper mother. So it's the two feminine dimensions are this essentially portable throne room of God, of King Solomon. But they have a kind of almost spatial metaphysical spatiality, if you will, right? This upper dimension, and the Holy One, blessed be He, Kutchabrichu, called it the Garden of Eden. Kutchabrichu kara le ginta de Eden. Now, the significance of Garden of Eden is very significant because I'll kind of give you a little bit of a spoiler, as it were, is that after all of this is over, Rabbi Abba says to Rabbi Shimon as he gets up, he says, Abba, Father, until now we have ad hacha ana havinan yatve betzila de ilane de chaye de ginta de Eden. Did I translate it? No, I'm just kidding. Right. So up until now, we have been sitting, literally, it seems, or is it metonymically, in the shade of the tree of life of the Garden of Eden itself. Right. So the tree, the earthly tree that is situated on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, right, where there is this experience of um, uh, the shade of this tree that prompts the mystical poetic um, speech, is itself quite literally the tree of life of the Garden of Eden, or at the very least, it is somehow standing in symbolically or metonymically for the tree of life in the Garden of Eden above. And this is it. This I find enormously fascinating, right? In the sense that that these mystics are experiencing the natural world, they are simultaneously experiencing the heavenly divine world, or perhaps there is a kind of seamless unity of the two, right? To experience one is to experience the other, because precisely because that which is in the lower world, according to the Zohar, is a reverberation of that which is in the upper world. And actually, all is connected in a kind of great chain of spiritual being. Therefore, the tree as I experience it in this world is essentially an experience of the upper world. So God planted that tree in the Garden of Eden for his enjoyment, for God's enjoyment, and his desire is to delight in it. Um, and
Sorry,
his
I don't know.
oh, okay, are we good? Oh, we're good. Uh, and um, and his desire is to that's not, I don't think that's on my end. In any event, imagine that those are the souls that are doing their thing in the Garden of Eden. Okay. So God planned for God's enjoyment, and God's desire is to delight in it with the souls of the righteous who are there, because there's a tradition that the souls of the righteous hang out in the Garden of Eden, studying Torah and doing other fun things, and the Holy One, blessed be He, descends at the midnight hour, especially to delight with them. And the soul, when it's asleep, a large portion of that soul, right, only enough to keep the body alive, stays with the soul, and the rest ascends to that Garden of Eden um, to delight with God. These souls who have no body in this world all ascend and are crowned there, and they have place from which to view and delight in the supernal pleasure that is called Noam Adonai, grace or the pleasure of Adonai. Um, it's interesting, by the way, it's even just occurring to me now, right? That this use of Noam is actually very interesting, right? Because it's Noam is also about pleasantness, right? Which would relate to their experience of the pleasantness of the shade that they experience in the natural world, right? They experience the the pleasantness, the noam, which I translate here as grace, which it can also be um, of God. It correlates to this pleasantness um, that exists above. And maybe Jeremy, you could scroll down just a drop if you wouldn't mind. That's great, perfect, thank you. Um, and then just to give you a fuller sense of the kind of the dynamic nature of Zoharic poetry and interpretation, there they are filled by all the desirable rivers of pure balsam. Nahare de Afar Simona Dachya. Afar Simon, balsam, is the upper palace, which is Bina, hidden and concealed. Apiryon, this pavilion or this palanquin, is the lower palace, which is Shechina, which has no samech until the letter samech, until it is supported istamich by the upper palace. Why? And if you look at the words, right, of Afar Simon and Apiryon, right, well, I guess there's also a mem missing, but it's specifically, it doesn't have the samech, so maybe it's the samech and the mem together, right? That makes for the difference between Afar Simon and Apiryon, and that lower palace, which is Apiryon, becomes Afar Simonized, if you will, when it receives its support in the form of samech mem from the flow from above. So that's a little bit of a close reading of a great passage, but really kind of gives you a window into the kind of literary analysis that takes place in the book. And this is particularly in the context, there are other examples that I give in the book of engagement with the natural world and how that stimulates and leads to theological, mystical reflection on the inner mysteries of God. Or how an experience of sensation, right? He's saying, how pleasant is the shade of this tree as I'm experiencing the beauty, right? This is actually also stemming from a sensation of beauty in the natural world, of overlooking Yam Kinneret, of overlooking the Sea of Galilee, of Yam Ginosar, and that is the stimulus, you recall, for Rabbi Shimon saying, we must crown this place with words of Torah, beauty. He doesn't say it quite that way, but how pleasant is the shade, this sensation, this experience demands of us that we speak words of mystical Torah to crown this place, to give it a kind of sacredness, perhaps. And then following that, a little bit later in the text, is that exclamation by Rashbi's son, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son, Rabbi Elazar, that we have actually been sitting up until now, actually in the shade of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So there's a lot more to say about the book. I'm not going to try to zoom, no pun intended, or I guess now pun intended, through that. Let's pause there. There's a lot of other interesting features in the book, including magical realism and the fantastic, and situating the Zohar in the context of other medieval literature. But I think now would probably be a good time to transition to some discussion, some Q&A, which I think Abby, you'll probably moderate.
Sure. I just would invite anyone to put a note in the chat or to raise your hand if you have a question, or anyone just want to break in and have a question. Yair Lior.
Yeah, I think this might be a little bit of a digression. First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. That was so interesting. Some of the students that are listening to this lecture right now are from my class, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism. So we're about to get to the Kabbalah part of the course in about 2 weeks. I feel like this might be a little bit of a digression, but you mentioned sorry, let me put this here so I actually look at the camera. You mentioned the fact that the possibility that the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and his disciples are traveling in the Galilee, like another Jew we know in the first century, perhaps, is not incidental. I know that Yosef Dan wrote a little bit about that, the correlations between that story, that monumental story of Christianity, that foundational story of Christianity in the Zohar. Can you say a little bit more about that? Why? What is the necessity to perhaps emulate or create some kind of Jewish reflection to that story? Just thoughts about that?
Yes, fantastic. Thank you for asking that question. It's very important. Several scholars have talked about this a little bit. I've discussed it some in the book too. So what I would say is a few things. First, there is a strong messianic theme in Zoharic literature. So the idea that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is actually the true Messiah, or the harbinger, or about to be the Messiah, is definitely a theme that's quite strong. Yehuda Liebes was the first to really reflect deeply on this, and others have as well. So that may be one piece, right? The kind of counter messianic story. It's like, you think you've got the messianic story, right? Let me tell you this other better one. But I think it also stems from the fact that that we can't escape the fact, and it's actually very important in terms of understanding the Zohar, that it was born and emerged in the heart of Christian Spain, right? The extent to which we can properly use the word Spain, right? So in the heart of Christian Spain, and was clearly heavily influenced by the majority culture that they were surrounded by, and there are a number of different examples of this. Among the points of influence, right, other than standing on the street corner and swapping religious stories with outside the Toledo market or something. I think one of the ways in which this took place, which both my colleague Sharon Corin and my colleague Ellen Haskell have written about, and also Tzachi Weiss has also written about, is that these Jewish mystics were living in towns that were dominated by cathedrals, right? And the outsides and the outsides of these cathedrals, which they couldn't possibly have not seen, right, on their way to Mincha or whatever, or just to walk around town. The outside reliefs were essentially visual versions of the gospel stories designed to tell the story of Christianity to the illiterate Christian, and perhaps also, right, in other words, you didn't have to know Latin, right, or emergent literary Castilian, but it was essentially to present the story in visual form to the illiterate Christian, or perhaps also to the other people like the Jews, minorities who were living there, as a kind of proselytization. So the Jews would have been and clearly were influenced in those ways. One, by the art that was visible to them without setting foot inside a cathedral or a church, right? It just would have been right in front of their noses. That's one very important piece of this. They're also another interesting example of a point of influence, and there were likely many, right? But another very important, there were also street plays that were done, right? So the dramatic Corpus Christi enactments and other types of passion plays that were done in the streets of these towns. So these things would have been very visible to the Jews, including the use of physical gestures, by the way, which I think is a very interesting example, right? Because we know that medieval dramatic literature utilized physical gesture in a very heavy way, in part because of amplification problems, right? You couldn't project so far, so you had to kind of act it out with your body as well. And then the other piece is that characters like or figures, leaders like Todros Abulafia, for example, not the poet, but the Kabbalist, who was known as El Rab, right, as kind of like essentially like the chief rabbi, was at the court of Alfonso X, among other people, and would have himself and he's likely thought to have been at least involved in early generations of what became the Zoharic circle. Liebes argues that he was perhaps even the model for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Liebes makes this argument in a couple of places. He would have also witnessed various things that were happening at the relatively cosmopolitan court of Alfonso X, right? El Sabio, who was very interested in bringing those different cultures into conversation, and the musical performance of the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which were performed there, and there are some interesting parallels that I discuss in chapter 6, actually, about a similarity between at least one particular scene in the Cantigas de Santa Maria about the Virgin Mary coming to save a band of lost Christians in the mountains, and the Shekhinah coming to save a group of Kabbalists lost in the mountains. It's more than just that. There's various points of such influence. So those are some possible avenues of influence, but at the very least, we know that they certainly were living in this Christian-dominated culture, at least at this period of time. It's not to say that there wasn't also important legacies of Arabic influence, probably a little bit more indirectly, if somewhat directly as well. And I also talk about that in chapter 6 in terms of some of the poets who incorporated different themes from that tradition as well. But it seems to be that there's reason to argue that there was something of a counter narrative to the Christian story, or at the very least allusions to it. Among the important books that have been written about this is, I mentioned Ellen Haskell's book, Mystical Resistance, uncovering the Zohar's conversations with Christianity. But others have written about this also. One of the older essays by Yehuda Liebes, Hashpot Notzriot, El Sefer Zohar, Christian influences on Sefer Zohar, and others.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think a related question is from Jeffrey Salloway. Do you want to go ahead, unmute yourself, Jeffrey?
Hi, Jeff. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
You're muted still.
Still muted. The Kol Dmama Daka. Ah, there you are.
Okay. So in this lovely book that I read called The Light Before Dawn, the author talks about the transmission of Middle Eastern culture in the direction of the Iberian Peninsula. Lovely, lovely read. So at the same time, you have a Berber Moorish influence in Spain. Does that integrate into the story as well?
So thank you. Yes, whoever wrote that book, kudos to them, right? Yes. So I think that is true. That is the case, and this is part of what I develop also in chapter 6, which is called the Zohar Frame Tale in Context. it seemed to have happened with respect to the Zohar, particularly via thinkers like Avraham ibn Ezra, in his Chai ben Mekitz, which itself was a paraphrase or a of sorts of Ibn Sina's work, right? So the philosopher Avicenna, and a number of other such examples like that. So there definitely seem to have been um, um, the legacy of the legacy of the makamat and of makama definitely seem to have found their way into this literature. Some was written about this quite some time ago by Gil Anindjar also, and part of what I do in that chapter is also particularly comparing a number of works, but particularly comparing Al-Kharizi's Tahkemoni, right? Yehuda Al-Kharizi, who was an important transmitter of Arabic philosophical influence. His Tahkemoni, which was a narrative frame tale about the pursuit of wisdom, and how we can see some very interesting parallels and correlations in Zoharic literature. So of course, some of this was from a slightly earlier period, so it's hard to know like exactly what the points of actual influence were. And then on the Christian side, we can also point to not only to the Cantigas de Santa Maria, but also to, let's say, correlations to the work by Juan Ruiz, Libro de Buen Amor, the Book of Good Love, which also reflects on, so that's not the Arabic side of it, but is also very significant, the Muslim side of it. So I would say yes to both, but in different ways. The Jews who wrote the Zohar seem to have been living in at that point a heavily Christianized society, but there was a lot of literary and probably social impact from the prolific Arabic culture that had been developed in the century before, in particular, and centuries before.
Thank you so much. I'm just aware of the time and I'd like to. I don't know if no one else has a question. Anyone else have a question or comment? And if not, I'm going to ask one short question or big question. So would you say primarily that all of these kind of literary and rhetorical devices, are they primarily for the sake of engaging the reader, drawing, that they are so natural to the historical context and such a strong feature of Christian literature, and that they were in the zeitgeist, and and or would you say that that all of these devices are there to raise the mystical knowledge of the reader? Are they there to raise me to the higher palace as a reader of the Zohar? Is that what these writers were doing, or is it simply to engage me in the text to kind of entertain me?
So very, very important. I think it's a combination of all of these. I probably less, I would say, entertainment in the way that certain works existed, though that may not be totally absent. But I would say, on the one hand, definitely the influence of the larger zeitgeist and so forth. Though you could say, well, then why is that less present in all these other Kabbalistic works, right? So why just the Zohar? So on the one hand, the Zohar reflects all those influences, but the question is, what really captured it's also why is the Zohar classic, and why did the Zohar capture the hearts of generations of readers, right? And in each generation, there seem to be people who love the Zohar, right? So why? In addition to its intention in doing that, and I do think, and this is part of what I do try to develop, and it's reflected in the title, "The Art of Mystical Narrative," is that there was a kind of aesthetic creativity that was consciously, self-consciously, or not or perhaps not consciously utilized in the formation of this beautiful text, right? That I think was, and in this sense, here I'm also thinking about some of the work of my colleague Melila Hellner-Eshed, who's and this is also true of Liebes's Zohar and Eros essay, but Hellner-Eshed in particular has written about the way in which the Zohar intentionally sought to stimulate the mystical spiritual experiences of its readers, right? So that reading it became a kind of contemplative experience. So I do think that, in direct relation to your question, that there was it's hard to imagine that it wasn't intentional attempt to inspire the reader to be drawn into what the Zohar called the Razin Deoraita, the mysteries of the Torah. And there are other passages, including one that's in among the excerpts that you received, where Rabbi Shimon exclaims and said, how is it possible that people don't realize the amazing mysteries that there are in the Torah, right? That they don't see it, right? So it's so part of, you might say, part of the Zohar's mission, if you will, or its purpose was through this aesthetic beauty, aesthetic beauty for its own sake, you could say, but also as a way of conveying that spiritual inspiration and power, and thereby stimulating the reader to devotion, to mystical experience, and to uncover the layers of mystical meaning that are hidden beneath, in their view, the superficial garment of outer reality, and to uncover that which stands beneath the surface layer of perception, that the secret, mysterious level of Torah, which is actually the divine pulsating within the Torah itself.
And it occurs to me that that's what fiction does so well. It invites you in, to the, it invites you into the story. I mean, a good story.
Yes,
It
yes.
seems to me why Hasidic rabbis tell stories or tell parables, or why the rabbis told parables. They have a way of drawing you in, engaging you imaginatively and emotionally.
Yes,
and,
100%. And I take that up somewhat in the narrative ethics chapter, in part influenced by Martha Nussbaum's thinking, but also quoting even Tolstoy's theory of art reflection, right? That one is infected by the story, right? That one, but what Nussbaum talks about in terms of narrative ethics is that storytelling, drama, cinema, novel, has the power to cultivate empathy and compassion and love in a way that let's say analytical philosophy doesn't, right? So if you want to so in other words, to convey an ethical principle through the artistic means can cultivate an empathy in the sense that it draws you into that world, right? And you can then have empathy by being in that person's shoes, even in your imagination, and that can change your virtue.
It's very cool. Now, I'm thinking about parables a lot, and Mishalim, and the way that a parable does something a little bit different, in that it engages you to think about right behavior, and what to do in a certain situation, and who's right and who's wrong, like Jesus's parables. And who is a good man, who's a just man, what you tell someone a story, like, and then they're in that situation of not just being told a message, but having to think through and arrive at that wisdom themselves.
Beautiful. I really think that that's true. I think we find some of that in the Zohar and elsewhere too. But it's absolutely the case as a kind that too as a kind of narrative ethics, right? That there's a kind of that through the story there becomes a kind of extrapolation or deduction.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I look forward to reading your book and continuing the conversation. I want to thank everyone for coming.